Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome all of you guys back here to the channel. And this is a new series, a new era, so to speak, here on the channel. That is a little bit different from anything else I've done on the channel so far. Um, I've expressed with you guys my love for movies. When I watched and reviewed 500 movies in 2025, um, and there's plenty of times on the channel, during those videos that I put out in the past where I've talked about, my love for wrestling. There's a lot of people that already know, I love wrestling. So let's go ahead and, kick this thing off with my story of how I got into wrestling. Um, so how I got into wrestling was truly a lot of different factors that I will get into in this video. Um, but let's start with the match that really put this into motion for me. This match, it took place back in 1990 in WCW between Sting and Ric Flair at the Great American Bash for the World Heavyweight Championship. Um, now keep in mind this may not be the first time that I watched wrestling, or the first match that I ever technically seen. Um, but it's the first and earliest one that I can remember that stands out, and the one that made me want to be a fan of wrestling. Um, so, when I was a kid, growing up, me and my family was always, going to the local video store and renting movies. I would rent video games and whatever. Back then, when you would rent videotapes, that the internet was not around, so it wasn't like we could go and check out a trailer or read reviews online or anything like that. Like what we have access to today. Um, all we had was just our own assumptions and our own imaginations that was just based on the cover of those boxes and the descriptions that were on the back, or with just maybe like a few little photos on the box or whatever, just giving us kind of a taste of what you were in store for. So everything was just kind of like done blindly in that way, as opposed to what we can do today. um and wrestling was definitely on my radar already, because of my older brother Mike, who was, he was a fan before I was, and we had a lot of the WWF LJN figures and the Remco AWA figures, and my mom even still has this old home video from 1988 where my brother is dressed and acting like Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. So, an interest in wrestling was definitely something that was sort of passed down to me. So yeah, my brother was definitely a key part of me getting into wrestling. Um, but back to what I was saying about the video store. I can remember it being close to Christmas that year in 1990, and I saw that VHS tape of Great American Bash 1990, on the shelf, as a new release, and I rented it because it just the front of that box stood out to me because I thought that this guy that was on the cover, with this face paint, looked really cool. And little did I know, that cool guy, that cool looking guy on the cover, would end up being my favorite wrestler of all time. So, um, I can remember my mom being like, "Oh, that's a wrestling tape," and it's surprising to me that I can remember this so vividly because it's really hard to remember things, from that far back. Just keep in mind, I was like 4 years old at this time, so but I guess that goes to show, how important wrestling is to me. for it to be, one of those core memories. Um, I'm more familiar nowadays, with that whole event of Great American Bash from 1990. Um, but at that time, like I said, I was only 4 years old, and my attention span was very limited at that age. Um, when I rented that tape, I only cared about seeing who this cool looking guy was with this face paint, that was on the cover. So, of course, I come to find out, that was the last match on the tape, as the main event. Um, and I remember watching it, and when Sting came out, I noticed that his face paint was different from what was on the video cover. And let me go ahead and throw that picture up for you guys real quick. Let's see. So yeah, so there is the video cover that was the cover of the tape that I rented back in 1990. You see Sting and Flair there on the cover, and Sting here, he has some cool makeup here. I really like that look with the black and the white. It's very simple yet amazing, and it's got a little star there in the corner. Super cool, right? But like I said, when I was watching that match on that tape, like I said, his face paint was different from what was on that cover, but that didn't matter to me because I loved that look so much, that American flag face paint and the gear that he had. It was just awesome, and it still stands as my very favorite Sting look to this day. Um, and I think a lot of that has to do with just the nostalgia of it and just what really helped me get into wrestling. I think that's why it might be my favorite. But the match was like 15 minutes long. But when you're a kid, it feels sometimes, when you're a kid watching wrestling, the matches feel a lot longer than what they actually were. But I was just absolutely hooked the whole time watching it. Just watching Sting as a kid was like watching this real life superhero in action or something. Um, I just and I loved what I was watching here, and I knew at that moment I definitely wanted to see more. So Sting became this instant favorite, of mine, and which would go on to end up being my favorite wrestler of all time. And just every time that he was on TV after that, I was just glued to the screen, man. Um, so, whenever I could remember that it was on, I would always watch WCW Saturday Night on TBS, 6:05 every Saturday night on TBS. Um, and I would rent those pay-per-views, the WCW pay-per-views on VHS, and whenever they would release them on tape and the video store would get them in or whatever, because I had never watched a pay-per-view live until WCW Starrcade in 1997. So it was a long time. I went a long time with just watching these pay-per-views after they had actually happened when I would rent the tapes or buy the tapes or whatever. Um, but now on the other side of the coin, there was WWF, which I also began to watch. And like I said earlier, thanks to my brother, I was already kind of familiar with WWF. Um, and the names like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man, Roddy Piper, Miss Elizabeth, Mr. Fuji, Hillbilly Jim, Andre the Giant, Iron Sheik, the Road Warriors. Names go on and on and on. And for many of those names that I just mentioned, my brother Mike, he had action figures of them that I would play with, early on without even really knowing anything about them, other than they were wrestlers. Because that's just what I was told by my brother or my parents or whatever. Um, so as I said earlier in this story, this was around Christmas time when I saw this tape and I saw Sting, and just everything about wrestling that I was coming to love already. Um, so, just like any other kid at that age around Christmas, I made a Christmas list. And, that year I asked for some wrestling stuff. And I'm sure, of course, I probably wanted Sting stuff. But where I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, WCW merchandise, at that time was just very hard to come by, as far as like purchasing it. Like I said, we had like the the VHS tapes that we could rent at the video store, but you know that was pretty much it, for a while at least. So like that was the cost of living in Eastern Kentucky growing up. Um, And like I said, I don't know if it was just that WCW stuff was hard to get, or they just didn't stock it at our local stores, or what. But WWF stuff was more easy to come by because WWF at this time was not only more popular, but they made a lot more merchandise available than what WCW did. They kind of had their hand in like everything, toys, shirts, other clothing materials, and posters, and lunch boxes, and just all kinds of stuff, video games. Because I don't think the WCW Nintendo game came out until after the first WWF game, which was WrestleMania. But I may have that backwards. I'm not sure. But like I said, but WWF, regardless, had their hand in so much merchandise, at that time. And like I said, because it was more popular because of guys like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man, um, that really caused these stores, not just in my area, but just everywhere, to want to get that stuff in because they knew it was going to sell like crazy. Um, and I got a lot of toys as a kid, and and it's hard to pinpoint, that far back, like when I got every wrestling toy that I had. Um, I don't remember if I even got any wrestling toys that year, when I asked for them after I was getting into wrestling. But what I do remember was getting this Hulk Hogan headband, that said, I think it either said Hulkster or Hulk Rules, and it also came with this robe, and the robe was like this silk-like material, and it was red and it was yellow. And on the chest, on the front, it had the WWF logo, and on the back, it had a picture of Hulk Hogan, and it said Hulk Rules. Um, and apparently, I was looking this up when I was before I was doing it. I was looking this up because I knew I was going to talk about that robe and that headband set that I got as a kid. And I was looking it up like around on eBay and places, and apparently it's now this rare piece of wrestler memorabilia. And I don't know if my mom even still has that, or where that thing is. But I do know that my mom has a photo of me somewhere, um, wearing that outfit. And if I can ever get her to find it, or if I can go over there to her house and find it myself, I'll post it over on the How I Got Into Wrestling Instagram page. So if you're on Instagram, you're not already following that Instagram page, be sure to head over there and give me a follow. Just search How I Got Into Wrestling. Um, and that's the username, and there you go. I'd appreciate that. But like I said, I've loved wrestling for so long, and at that time, when I was first getting into it, uh, I would have my parents, just buy me the toys that were new at the time, of the WWF Hasbro's, and WCW was releasing figures from Galoob, and just whenever they could find them. Like I said, it was kind of a like um, very hard time finding these figures back then because they were so huge, and wrestling is just so huge, not only just in Eastern Kentucky, but the southern part of the United States. Wrestling is huge. It always has been. Um, but just whenever they could find them, they would always, pick up, stuff that I didn't have. And I think sometimes my mom or either my mom or my dad, one, they would like keep a list of the ones I already had so they would know like not to get those if they saw them at the store or whatever. Um, but this was also during a time in my childhood where I was also in love with Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers and comic book heroes, Freddy Krueger and Jason and Ernest and Pee Wee's Playhouse, just many many other things. Because I loved so much as a kid, and I gotta say, I was born in the '80s, but I primarily grew up in the '90s, and I'm absolutely blessed to have grew up in that decade because there was just so many amazing things during that time. Um, but I think the moment that I became full blown obsessed with wrestling and just knew that this was going to be one of my favorite things ever of all time. I would have never guessed it would be like my number one passion, above everything, above horror, above whatever else. But the moment I became full blown obsessed with wrestling was probably in 1996, and it was shortly before my 10th birthday. I was turning 10 years old that September in '96, but I was on vacation in I think it was Virginia Beach, I believe, and I remember this so vividly. Um, I remember like just laying. My mom and dad were out on the balcony of the hotel room. They were just, talking, I guess, like just looking at the ocean or whatever, because we were at the beach. And I was there in the hotel room laying on the bed because I had been sunburnt, like terribly, terribly sunburnt that day from playing on the beach. And I think my mom had like the cooling gel or some kind of shit all over me, like to try to to take the pain away. But you know, that kind of went all out of my mind once I was getting ready to watch WCW Monday Nitro that night, in the hotel. And of all nights to be there and watch Nitro, it was the day after WCW Bash at the Beach 1996. And I remember watching when they showed that footage of Hulk Hogan turning on WCW and forming the NWO. And I was this 9-year-old kid just in absolute shock because, at that age, I still thought wrestling was real. I thought these guys were really these characters, and you know that they were, and they really hated each other. I really thought that, and I thought they were really trying to hurt each other. Um, so I hated all the bad guys. I hated all the heels. At that point, I had been watching wrestling for I think like nearly 5 years. And in that time, I only knew Hulk Hogan as one of, if not the biggest wrestling good guy on the planet. And after seeing this, I now hated his guts. I hated him and Kevin Nash and Scott Hall and just all the NWO as it would continue to grow over that next year. Um, and that's really, I think, where the obsession began with me because I was drawn into this so much more than ever, but just because of the drama of it all. I didn't realize that that's what it was at that time, but that's 100%. I'm telling you, that's 100% what it was. Um, the formation of the NWO just changed everything in professional wrestling, and it made wrestling bigger than ever at that time. And now here we are, in 2026, where we'll soon be, celebrating 30 years of the NWO. That's so insane to think. Like, and it really shows my age because, like I said, like I was when the NWO formed, I was 9 years old, and here we are 30 years later. I'm going to be 40 later this year. So it's crazy. Like, what a journey this has been as a wrestling fan. Um, and just at the time of the NWO's formation, even though I was heartbroken, about Hogan, become this awful bad guy that I now hated, you know, I still had that hope that Sting and Macho Man and all of WCW would get their revenge. Um, but week after week, of course, the NWO would continue to grow, and they'd always get the upper hand, and they'd make a plan to even cause WCW to doubt and betray Sting, you know, which would lead to the iconic Crow Sting persona. And 1997, that next year would end up being, in my opinion, WCW's greatest year. um, and it's crazy to think, like I said, the NWO formed in July of '96, and it was Hogan, Hall, and Nash. And to some people, when they see this new stable formed in wrestling, they're like, "That well, three guys, maybe four, maybe five, is enough, right?" Okay, so within 5 months, like I said, they formed in July of '96, and within 5 months, by the end of the year, the NWO had 15 members in that faction, and that at that time that was fucking unheard of. So it was just, I mean, it was just crazy. And all my friends in school, were the same way I was, starting back in that summer of '96. All we would mostly talk about was wrestling. And that was what was going on over in WCW, with the NWO, or what was going on over in WWF, because during that year of '96 you had Shawn Michaels title run, after he won it at WrestleMania that year, and then you had guys like Mankind coming in. You had Steve Austin, going into transitioning into the Stone Cold persona, because previously he was doing like the Ringmaster persona in WWF, but he was transitioned into the Stone Cold character in '96, where he won the King of the Ring and all that. And they, like I said, him, Mankind, these other guys were becoming these new stars there. And Paul Bearer would turn on the Undertaker at SummerSlam that year, and join Mankind, and it would kind of kick off this whole story between Mankind, or not Mankind, but Paul Bearer and the Undertaker, which would later, Paul Bearer would also bring in Kane. And that whole story between Kane and Undertaker, to me, that's the greatest story ever told in wrestling, is that original story that started off in '97 between Undertaker and Kane. Um, I got to give credit to Paul Bearer when it comes to that whole story, because he really is the guy that made that story so dramatic and so appealing, and making people that weren't even necessarily wrestling fans want to tune in and see what happens next with the story between Undertaker and Kane. That's like, that was some amazing TV back then. And but just me and my friends would talk about it all the time. We continue, and all that stuff would continue to develop more and more, over the next year from '96 to '97, with the early stages of the Attitude Era and all that. Um, but if you weren't around as a wrestling fan, in the mid to late '90s, man, I really wish that you could have been, because that feeling during that time is really indescribable. And just any other wrestling fan during that time would tell you the same thing. I guarantee it. um it was just an absolute wild time to be alive, and just to get to experience everything that was taking place was just fucking amazing, man. um my obsession for pro wrestling has just grown more and more only with time. For years I've collected action figures and posters and shirts and magazines, VHS tapes, and really just whatever I could find, there for a while. But, there's so much wrestling merch available nowadays. It's kind of too much to try and collect everything you see. But if I can, find room for it and I can afford it, and that's the most important thing, right? Um, I'll sure as hell, add it to the collection if I can. Um, but speaking of the magazines, especially ones from the '90s, I remember being fascinated reading issues of Pro Wrestling Illustrated and The Wrestler and just all these other wrestling magazines. And I mean, I used to get those things all the time because magazines were cheap back then. You could get magazines for like $3.99, $4.99 or something. What is it now? I went to Walmart not long ago and I was looking at the magazines they had, and they're like $15, 15, $16 for a magazine now. Uh, I think you can still get like Pro Wrestling Illustrated, I think, but it's like $10 at least for that. But most magazines nowadays are like 15, $16. I'm like, fuck that. I ain't paying that. But man, back in the day, I would buy a ton of wrestling magazines and at the store, if people had them at the flea market or yard sales or whatever, anywhere I could find them, I'd buy them, man. I didn't care what condition they were in. I don't care if they was, about falling apart or whatever. I would still get them and, read them, and I just wanted to learn everything that I could. And, these magazines, they would cover all these other promotions aside from WWF and WCW, and I would see all these other wrestlers. I didn't even know who they were. They were new to me when I would see them in these magazines, because you couldn't find these guys or these promotions on TV, especially ECW during that time. And so in those magazines, I'd read about guys like Raven and Sandman and the Dudley Boys, and I'd see their photos in there, and I read about this match or that match or what they were doing, or if they did like an interview in the magazine or whatever. But other than that, I didn't know much about these guys. But then in 1997, these guys were starting to show up in WCW and WWF, and because Raven, he went over to WCW, and then they kind of did the whole little small ECW invasion in WWF, because like WWF was helping ECW promote their first pay per view, which is barely legal. There in '97, but I would see those guys on WWF and WCW TV, and I'd be like, "Holy crap! I know these guys, from these magazines." And beyond that, their custom wrestling tapes was a big thing back in the '90s. Um, and my only exposure to seeing a lot of those ECW matches early on was through these tapes that me and my friends would acquire from the flea market, or um, maybe my friend had a tape. I'd trade him something for that tape, or just whatever. Um, but so the more exposure that I got from all these other promotions outside of WWF and WCW, you know, the more love that I had for wrestling overall. You know, I wanted to know as much as I possibly could about wrestling, and I still strive to this day to be that same way, and and learn as much as I can. So flash forward to all these years later, I'm still watching wrestling. I never stopped. I never stopped watching wrestling. Like, I never took a break from it or anything for the past, what is it now? Like 36 years, like I've been watching wrestling and I've never taken a break from it. I've always been consistently watching it, all throughout the year after year. And just over the years, I've gained a ton of knowledge, from all these multiple promotions aside from the ones I've already mentioned. I've learned to love stuff from like New Japan and TNA and Ring of Honor and Pro Wrestling Gorilla and Chikara, and now you got ones nowadays, like AEW and Evolve, and just which Evolve is associated with WWE now, and but it used to not be. And AAA the same way. I started following a lot of different Mexican, like AAA and CMLL, and I even follow like JCW. And let me say something about JCW. JCW is starting to get good again, guys. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Vince Russo, but I've been watching some of that JCW lunacy stuff here lately, and I like it. I can't lie, man. But just all these different promotions, including local promotions here in Kentucky. I follow them, and I just try to learn whatever I can. It's just because that there's so much wrestling content out there these days, though, thanks to the internet, that it's literally impossible to keep up with every bit of it. But, like I said, I follow a lot of this stuff, and, I damn sure try my best. Um, but, I'm a fan who will watch anything, when it comes to wrestling, really. I don't believe, nor do I support, any of that tribal bullshit where, people pick sides, or, have a hatred for specific wrestlers or promotions they refuse to watch or whatever. I mean, now, definitely, I'll watch stuff and I'll complain about it, but at the end of the day, I'll still watch it. I'll be like, "Man, this is fucking stupid," but then I'll just keep watching it because, like, it's all entertaining to me in some way or another. I just truly love the business, and to me, wrestling is the most unique art form to ever exist on this planet. And if you take time to get into it, you'll find there's a little something for everyone somewhere in wrestling. And I mean that, like, because wrestling covers all different cultures and races, and sexual orientation, and just fashion sense, and just general interest amongst everything. Like, I can guarantee you, if there's something that you have interest in, or something that adapts to your lifestyle, that thing also exists in professional wrestling somewhere. And it's just to me, that's what makes wrestling so interesting, and so much more entertaining. And then, aside from all that, there's so much that just goes into it production wise, and there's something absolutely fascinating about that. From the characters to the storylines to the training and the skill and the talent, and just everything else that comes with it in that sense. But then you have like the music, the entrances, the lighting, the camera work, and everybody that works on these shows, and just most importantly us, the audience, the fans. you know there's so many different factors at play that really makes this so fucking amazing. And some of my best friends in life are wrestling fans. Some of the best people that I have come in contact with and met, and had conversations with. I've enjoyed myself the most, with all these people when we're talking about wrestling. And, the biggest thing out of that, one of the first things me and my wife initially connected on was wrestling, and our mutual love for it. Um, when I met her, right before we started dating, she actually went to the Monday Night Raw, and I think it was in either Lexington or Louisville, Kentucky, where the infamous shooting star RKO, that Randy Orton gave to Evan Bourne, is like all the top like RKO lists of all time and all that. But she was at that Raw. She got to see that live, and I was like, holy shit, that's super cool. And I think she was also like running this Randy Orton like fan page on the internet at the time, and I was like, "That's awesome!" I was like, "I found this girl who loves wrestling," and you know, but the big thing to come out of that was because of her, I got to fulfill this lifelong dream of getting to go to WrestleMania, and we got to attend WrestleMania 30 back in 2014 in New Orleans, which would, funny enough, would also double as our honeymoon. So it was like WrestleMania slash honeymoon slash ghost tour extravaganza, because we were going on all these different ghost tours there in Louisiana from New Orleans and Baton Rouge and all that. And it was just one of the greatest trips ever. And I have my wife Candace to thank for so much for that. Helping me, helping that dream come true for me of going to WrestleMania. It was really something else. And I mean, we witnessed history there. We've seen the streak get broken by Brock Lesnar. Um, just crazy, to witness that. That's a whole other story. But as you can see, wrestling is very important to me. And, I know it's also very important for a lot of you guys out there. That's why I wanted to start this series here on the channel. Of course, I already know my own story of how I got into wrestling, and now I've shared a little bit of that story with you guys. Um, but this series is not really about me. I created this series because I want to know more about other wrestling fans and wrestlers out there, because I'm sure a lot of wrestlers out there didn't just become wrestlers because, hey, there's money in this, it's a good business, which I'm sure there are some guys like that, but a lot of guys that are wrestlers out there were wrestling fans first. And like I said, I want to know more about those guys, about these other wrestling fans, about those wrestlers who were once wrestling fans, and just how they got into it. And I'd love to have them share their stories with me and you guys out there on here on the channel, sometime as a guest. I would absolutely love that. And to kind of touch on that, I've already got a few interviews with some fellow wrestling fans lined up, and at least one wrestler. I've got one with at least one wrestler lined up. I'm still working on getting some of those scheduled here on the channel, but the first interview will actually be tomorrow on the channel, and that will be at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. So we want to get in an interview with my friend John Grande of Grande's Graveyard. So you can head over to his channel after this, subscribe to him, check out all of his content, or you also go to his Instagram page and then follow him there. So just be sure you check out John's stuff. He's an absolutely great guy. Puts out some great content, very entertaining. Can't wait to have him here on episode 2 of how I got into wrestling tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time, guys. So it'll be right before the Super Bowl. So that's why we're doing it at that time. That way we can get that interview in, and then we can all go watch the Super Bowl and watch all those fucking awesome Super Bowl commercials and see the Avengers Doomsday trailer. I'm hoping, at least. I don't really give a damn about the football game that's happening, but I'm ready to see those. It's a tradition every year. We watch the Super Bowl. We don't follow football all throughout the year, but we do watch the Super Bowl every year, and we like watching the commercials and just everything that comes with it. It's just the whole thing. But so just be sure to check that out. That episode 2 tomorrow, the interview with John Grande from Grande's Graveyard. Uh, and be sure to subscribe to the channel here if you haven't already. And just share the channel out there. And just let people know. But before I go, guys, I see a lot of people in the chat here talking. Just want to look at some comments before I go. See, John Grande is here from Grande's Graveyard. He's actually here on the streams. His CraterMania is running wild. See, one of my best friends, Kevin, is here. He says he was 6 years old when the NWO formed. Yeah, man, that's a crazy time to be alive. Kevin also says that he has a couple from the, oh, I guess he's talking about like the VHS tapes that he got from the flea market here a few years back. And John, like I said, I was having him on the channel tomorrow. He says he's looking forward to it. And thank you kindly again. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. And John will be the very first guest that I'll have here on the CraterMania YouTube channel. I've never shared any of my videos like on, had somebody as a guest with me on any of my videos. So I'm honored to have John here on the channel joining me tomorrow, where we're going to talk about how he got into wrestling. So definitely check that out, and just look for all of those future, episodes of how I got into wrestling here on the channel. Like I said, I'm still getting a lot of those scheduled, you guys, so just bear with me. But again, thank you so much for just taking the time to watch this video, and allowing me to share my story with you guys. And as I always say, I love you guys, and have a good night.